No quid pro quo. No quid pro quo. Everyone has been saying no quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo happened
He
here.
says it.
He says there's a quid pro quo. Oh, there's no quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. To the quid pro quo being discovered.
It's some type of a quid pro quo. We heard quid pro quo. Let's get quid pro quo. But an implicit quid pro quo.
Not a quid pro. It was a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo. What?
No quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo. This isn't a quid pro quo.
No quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. No quid pro quo.
It's quid pro quo. I don't have to say this is quid pro quo for it to be quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Let's
quid pro quo.
No quid pro quo.
There is no quid pro quo as a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo or not.
Explicit quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. The quid pro quo. When you quid pro quo of the quid pro quo.
A quid pro quo. Quid pro quo, a quid pro quo. If a quid pro quo, not quid pro quo.
a quid pro quo.
Oh, quid pro quo. Is quid pro quo or not?
Or a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo whatsoever.
Quid pro quo.
That the no quid pro quo comment.
No quid pro quo for
No quid pro quo. The quid pro quo. Oh, this wasn't a quid pro quo. That's the quo in the quid pro quo. No, this is not a quid pro quo. No, there's no quid pro quo here.
There was any quid pro quo that there was no quid pro quo.
There was no quid pro quo. No quid pro quo.
In this case, there wasn't a quid pro quo, but it was quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo here.
Quid pro quo. It almost doesn't matter if there was quid pro quo.
There was quid pro quo to say that line, that there was no quid pro quo.
No quid pro quo.
There was no quid pro quo is the truth?
But there was no quid pro quo.
There was no quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo.
The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quos of any kind. No quid pro quo.
Of quid pro quo is that there is no quid pro quo.
No quid pro quo comment in his text that
Quid pro quo.
classic quid pro quo.
Alleged quid pro quo. 8 times quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. It would be quid pro quo.
Was part of a quid pro quo.
This came out. It was quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo. There is no pro quo.
A quid pro quo, which
Quid pro quo of quid pro quo.
And what you don't have is a quid pro quo.
don't need a quid pro quo.
In one, there's a quid pro quo.
I don't know that there's a quid pro quo in either.
Who raised the issue of quid pro quo? You don't think that was a quid pro? If you look at Biden, is that a quid pro quo?
I don't think quid pro
United
quo
States
is,
Senator,
I don't
sitting
think
senator.
quid pro quo is necessary.
A quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo, Mr. Powers. Yes. Squid pro row.